Hello from a very windy North Cumbria, and thank you for inviting me to speak at Current Archaeology Live this year. Richborough. Richborough is a site, a Roman site, which has generally been known on signage in publications and virtually everywhere you look as Richborough Roman Fort. And in general, it's the military aspects of the site that are best known and that have received most attention. This is hardly surprising when the surviving features of the late 3rd and 4th century Saxon shore fort are so imposing and so obvious. The site's located on the Wonsum Channel, the now silted waterway which historically separated the Isle of Thanet from the mainland. It's rightly celebrated as the location where the Claudian conquest of Britain began in AD 43, and the evidence for this was recovered in the excavations carried out principally within the visible shore fort walls by J.P. Bush Fox in the 1920s and 1930s. At the base of his stratigraphic sequence, he identified a pair of long ditches backed by an earthen rampart and having a single timber gate, which was the point of origin of the later Watling Street. These ditches and this bank are interpreted as the bridgehead fortification defending the beachhead of the invasion, defending the fleet and material coming ashore. The post holes of this gate, 4 post holes of this gate, were re-excavated and the plan confirmed in 2020 as part of our excavation, which was also going to examine the amphitheatre and which was due to begin on March the 23rd, 2020. And we all remember what happened then. We did at least manage to do the work on the gate the weekend before lockdown began. And here you see the re-excavation of one of the big post pits of this Claudian gate. Now, the 1st century Claudian phase and the 3rd, 4th century Saxon shore phase are 2 military episodes in the continuing history of the site, which occurred 2 centuries apart. This lecture will look at the broader picture of the site while referring to these 2 military phases where necessary. This shows the archaeology of Richborough as it was known in 1968. You see, obviously, the outline of the Saxon shore fort walls, side streets running off Watling Street, one building that had been seen on aerial photography, the earthworks of the amphitheatre, and a pair of temples. An excavation took place in 2001 to examine one of the temples, and it usefully showed both that the temple walls were built of chalk blocks, bonded with brick tempered mortar, but also that they were stratigraphically early and probably dated to the 1st or 2nd century. This chalk building is in stark contrast to the Kentish ragstone used in the Saxon shore fort walls. Also at 2001, at the same time, our picture of the extent of the site completely changed when the fields surrounding the late fort were subjected to geophysical survey and also to aerial photographic transcription, both of which showed the extent of the site and that Roman occupation spread across 21 hectares between the fort and the amphitheatre. Though he could not know its extent, Bush Fox recognised the phases of this town occupation. Here's his plan of warehousing and shops in the early Flavian period, and here the late Flavian plan, featuring the cruciform feature which puzzled archaeologists for 2 centuries, until it was revealed as the base of a huge monumental arch clad in white Italian marble that sat in the centre of the town. This aerial photograph shows the extent of the Roman town of Richborough with the prominent earthwork of the amphitheatre in the background. You note the position of the foundation of the arch. You compare with this reconstruction by Peter Lorimer, which shows the site, the town, as it might have appeared in the mid-2nd century. And it's the amphitheatre and our excavation on the site last autumn to which I now would want to turn. Last year's excavation was the final chance after 2 cancellations due to COVID in March 2020 and again in March 2021. But any remarks I make here are preliminary because we only came off site on November the 19th last year. The excavation itself is a research project carried out by Historic England on behalf of English Heritage to gather more information on the site, which is at last being made accessible to visitors. The earliest depiction of the amphitheatre seems to be from this 1548 chart of Thanet and Sandwich, The crenellated square of the Saxon shore fort is clear, but what's remarkable is the adjacent structure, which must be the amphitheatre, and is certainly the earliest depiction of any amphitheatre in Britain. The image is broadly contemporary with John Leland, Henry VIII's antiquary, who described the Saxon shore fort and what he thought was a circular fortification lying a bow shot away. In 1776, William Stukely illustrated the fort from an imagined aerial perspective. Again, the Saxon shore fort with the cruciform foundation prominent, and in the background, the amphitheatre is labelled as such. In this image, the amphitheatre looms over the fort like Vesuvius, but in fact, although on a relatively high point, it's considerably less dramatic. This is the second of Stukely's images from 1776 from his Itinerarium Curiosum. And in this volume, Stukely was the first person to recognise any amphitheatre in Britain, and he identified three. Firstly, Richborough, and then the rather better known amphitheatres at Silchester and at Maunbury Rings, Dorchester. Now, not only was the Richborough Amphitheatre one of the first to be identified as such, it was actually the very first to be excavated. It was explored by a local antiquary from Sandwich, William Henry Rolfe, and we're fortunate to have the letter that he wrote to one of the leading archaeological figures of the day, Charles Roach Smith, describing his work. Smith was just finishing his book entitled The Antiquities of Richborough, Reculver and Limb in Kent, and Rolfe's letter arrived in time to be included verbatim in the volume, which was published in 1850. Rolfe's men had cast around until they found a patch of Roman mortar on the 19th of October, 1649, as recorded here, and dug down to find what he termed the outer wall. There's no doubt that he simply followed this wall, digging down to the wall top and investigating further in rare spots. And this rough plan was included in his letter to Smith. But Smith published much more, a rather neater plan drawn up by a local surveyor, John Noakes Coleman, and profiles across the earthwork and elevations of excavated walls, including an elevation of the arena wall and a plan and elevation of the walls of these two walls radiating off the main arena wall. When the Coleman plan and our resistivity survey plan were compared, it looked as if Coleman had his north point wrong. You can see the differentiation in the shape here against the north point. But once the Rolfe plan was corrected according to the change in the orientation of magnetic north since 1850, the match was much better. Rolfe's so-called outer wall was clearly the arena wall, and radial structures ran off it into the area of the seating bank behind. The survey shows symmetrically opposed large circular anomalies that looked like structures. We were thinking towers perhaps, or complex entrances. And it looked also as if the wall stubs were running off the arena wall to become part of these structures. Also very clear are the funnel-shaped entrances into the arena on either end of the long axis of the amphitheatre. The results from magnetometry were almost completely complementary. Here I've highlighted the location of the arena wall in yellow. There is an appearance of structures of some kind off to the north of the amphitheatre, and this very strong magnetic response which occurs symmetrically or rather concentrically with the line of the arena wall. So it's decided to excavate a trench to explore the archaeology revealed by both of these geophysical methods. The apparent circular structure shown on the resistivity, and the structures to the north of the amphitheatre shown on the resistivity. And the initial machining proved disappointing. Those circular structures proved to be banks of natural pebble beds, purely geological. And here we see a supervisor looking in a puzzled way at an extent of natural pebbles with not a sign of a wall. And the top of the arena wall we did find in the bottom of Rolfe's trench was over 1 metre below surface. However, we did reveal the top of the arena wall and another wedge-shaped piece of wall. What was puzzling was that these walls, which were obviously going to be quite high standing, were buried in a very deep and very consistent, unstratigraphically differentiated deposit of colluvium. A weekend of torrential rain showed how this was formed. The soil is incredibly light and moves very quickly in heavy rain. The fans of silt to the right of the shot here show the formation process that buried the amphitheatre walls. The soil eroding out in the rain of the banks of pebbles which the silt contained. What had happened became obvious. Amphitheatres are created by digging out an arena and building a revetment wall around it, casting the spoil up against an outer wall in order to form a built-up seating bank. When the arena wall collapsed or was robbed, it ceased to support the seating bank, which then naturally, through gravity and through natural erosion, eroded down to fill the arena wall again, and bury the surviving structure. Understanding this meant that we could remove this material wholesale by machine. And the walls that we found were the arena wall and also the two side walls that Rolf had illustrated. These were excavated in two areas. The trench sides, of course, had to be stepped for safety purposes, and very, very deep trenches. The area where the arena wall was exposed confirmed Rolf's observation that the walls were built chalk blocks. They were also actually bonded with brick tempered mortar, exactly like the early temples. And this began to suggest to us an early construction date. Chalk is a locally available resource, whereas the Kentish ragstone, which was used for the Saxon shore fort, is imported from further north. The amphitheatre, along with the temples, was probably therefore built before the ragstone began to be exploited using purely local, the only local stone material. The surprise here, however, was unrecorded by Rolf, the fact that the arena wall was painted and the painted plaster survived to some extent in situ. You see here a blue vertical stripe separating zones of yellow and red, which might be imitation marble or might even have been figurative. Arena wall painting was extensive in the Roman Empire, though, finding areas where the paint survives in situ and enough to hint at pattern is rare empire-wide, being found on under 20 sites. Perhaps the most elaborate is Pompeii, where well, this is the amphitheatre as it appears today. These are paintings recorded in 1821 that sat up on the arena wall. And although I wouldn't claim that Richborough ever looked like this, nonetheless, it does show what was possible and what was done in the centre of the empire. The two walls recorded by Rolf turned out to flank a chamber opening off the arena, most likely a carcere, in which animals or humans were held before emerging into the arena. Again, we can see this very broad, very bold red stripe in the wall painting on the arena wall, showing that this painting probably went around the entire circuit. The two internal facing walls of the carcere. On the left is the wall excavated by Rolf and recorded by Rolf. The one on the right, which he didn't examine, has a vertical timber slot let into it. Very strangely, these walls seem to be built up against the earth bank behind, the natural earth bank behind. These are just two of the puzzling aspects to this chamber, which will require a lot more thought and consultation of comparanda before we can understand it. Rolf recorded these features. You can see his plan of the carcere that we re-excavated, the elevation of this side wall, the left-hand side wall. And delightfully, he'd actually left his mark. He caused the date, 1849, to be carved into one of the chalk blocks in the wall that he recorded. On completion of the excavation of the arena wall and the Carceres in this area, our colleagues from Historic England came out to record the whole site through photogrammetry and produced a 3D model which has already shown its value in interpreting the site. I'll try and load this model. There it comes. We use manipulator to show the curvature of the arena wall there, to show the structure of the Carceres with its various architectural features, and it's already proved useful in our thoughts on interpreting the site. What remains, therefore, was to understand the outer wall of the amphitheatre, what this looked like. And the area where this should be was the area of the high magnetic response, which in plan reflects the curvature of the arena wall. It transpired that this response was produced by an extraordinary area of burning, which indeed did mirror the curve of the wall. See it curving back to where the people were working there. When machining this area, another surprise was waiting for us, the clear evidence for Roman turf construction. You see the striations in this section of turf work. And this was the first indication that the rear wall of the amphitheatre was in fact turf-built construction. Here we see a complete section through the 6-metre thick turf outer wall of the amphitheatre. This was probably a freestanding structure. It is similar in width to the turf wall of Hadrian's Wall. Turf was by no means an inferior building material in the Roman period, but a natural expedient where there was little stone, and indeed often used in preference to stone. We've already seen that the only stone available locally was the chalk. Turf architecture occurs in the building of frontier defences and forts across the empire. Now, in order to build a turf wall to height around the circumference of the amphitheatre, a huge amount of turf would be required. In fact, a very substantial area would need to be stripped, possibly almost the whole of Richborough Island, suggesting yet again that the amphitheatre is an early structure built before the town had spread to cover the area available for turf stripping. The turf was sampled to examine the evidence for the pre-Roman natural environment, and also to try and get some idea of the source of the turf. And this, although these samples are yet to be processed, there is already early indications. The white specks in these turf layers are the tiny mollusks of a species that lives in a salt marsh environment. And the use of wet salt marsh turf shows that the builders are using every bit of material they could lay their hands on. The burnt material, we don't as yet understand. It's deep, it reflects the curvature of the amphitheatre, and as you can see from this image, it's sort of cut into the back of the turf wall. It seems to reflect timber structures that were indeed cut into the back of the turf wall, presumably at a time when the amphitheatre was no longer functioning. Structures evidenced by stake holes there, and also by burnt material, which may be wattlework, or may be even roofing material, organic roofing material. And at the base, very base of this burning, was a coin dated to the usurpation of Carceres around 290, which gives us a terminus postquem, I think, not for the destruction of these buildings, but for their construction. So late 3rd century constructions within the back of the amphitheatre wall. Finally, the long trench dug to sample the area behind the amphitheatre. The geophysical, the magnetometry traces are confirmed. This ditch, this feature here, is the long ditch at the bottom of the trench. This area in contrast to any of the work in the amphitheatre, was rich in finds. And in fact, 250 plus 4th century coins were found in topsoil and features. This coinage dated right to the end of the Roman period in Britain, the late 4th, early 5th century. The features contained a great deal of animal bone, and it suggests that here we have a fringe area of the town where some form of animal processing industry is going on, but that this was taking place right at the end of the conventional date of Roman Britain, right to the end of the 4th century, 5th. This suggests that the town remained in occupation to its full extent right up to the very latest part of the Roman period, the late 4th century into the 5th century. And this disproves the long-held idea that Richborough shrunk back around the Saxon shore fort in the late period. On the contrary, the town remained a going concern to the end. It's salutary to note that this narrow trench on the back of the amphitheatre is the only trench into the 21-hectare town to have been excavated under modern conditions. Indeed, the only trench to be excavated into the town since the work within the walls of the fort in the 1930s. So, as an indication of the extent and of the survival into the late period of the town, this is extremely interesting and extremely important. So these are preliminary ideas, and a great deal of analysis of the results and its wider implications is needed, but I hope you've enjoyed this very interim statement on what was a fantastic project. And I'd like to thank those who did the work and also to you for listening. Thank you very much.